So we're going to be reading from Luke chapter 16 this morning, and I have it up here on the screen, but anybody who wants to follow along, I'll be starting in Luke chapter 16, starting in verse 1, and it says this: Jesus told his disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you can be manager any longer. You cannot be manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." So he called in each one of his master's debtors, and he asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. And the manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, "And how much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." The Pharisees, who loved money, heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value is highly detestable in God's sight." So this is a very obscure parable. Be honest, who here has didn't even know this existed in the Bible? Maybe a couple. Yeah, let's be honest, this is a weird parable. This is not the one that you're going to find when you're reading your devotional book in the morning. This is not the one that is most sermons and Bible studies are taught on. This is usually not even found. If you look for a list of parables, this one is usually not even listed in the list of parables. There's a few reasons. One is, on the surface, it seems so contradictory. Why would Jesus be telling the story of a man who lied and cheated his master and use it as an example of how you are to be trustworthy in his kingdom? It seems like, why would he tell this? This doesn't make any sense. Also, because it's confusing. Even in the verses where Jesus is describing what to do, it doesn't seem to make sense. He talks about how can you be trusted if you've been dishonest with somebody else's property, but that was the point of the story. This is a very confusing parable, and so if you find it confusing, that's okay. It's meant to be that way. Many people find it confusing. But I think that we can find something significant and meaningful here. If we're using the typical method that we usually approach the Bible with, where we read a small passage and we let it stand alone and we don't look at anything around it, this is going to be a tough parable for us to understand and to come away with understanding and hearing God's voice when we're reading it. But if we are going to head and look at it, trying to hear God's voice by also looking at how it aligns with the rest of his word, with the rest of what he is speaking, we can begin to find some meaning and some understanding of what Jesus might be trying to teach with this story. So we can look at other passages, we look at the verses around it, we look at other books in the Bible, and we specifically also look at what was happening right before we hear this story. And we find some things. Here in at the end of this, I made sure that I included the end portion of this in the parable. In verses 13 and 15, we hear two things. One, we hear about how somebody is consumed by something, how they are devoted. Devoted was one of the words used at the end. You cannot be devoted to one master because you will despise the other. We hear this idea of being so consumed by something, so absorbed in something, that you're willing to just come up with anything to make it happen. That is what this shrewd servant did. He was so consumed with finding a solution to his impending job loss that he got really creative really fast. So we hear about something that is so all-encompassing. It just consumes everything. And we know that that is something we hear about in the rest of the Bible. How often do we hear the phrase, we are to love the Lord with all our heart, with all our mind, and with all of our strength? We are to have an all-consuming love for God. It is to consume every part of us. There is to be so much devotion in that there's not really a lot of space for anything else. Also in verses 13 through 15, we hear another thing. We hear about what is worthy and what is of value. And the very end of verse, the last few words there, was what people think are worthy, what people hold dearest, God despises. I think we as human beings have kind of messed up our priorities. And if you're reading Luke and you're reading the book of Luke and you're reading several chapters beforehand, there's time and time again that Jesus is giving examples. His conversations with people, his conversations with the disciples, is that what we think of as first, how we measure things, is not how it's done in the kingdom of heaven. So I think we hear this so many times, we can begin to understand that there is these two common things that apply to this parable as we understand today. But I think this idea of what are we devoted to and what is of value? How do we measure worth? And we can see this explicitly in this chapter right before this one. In chapter 15, there are three stories that Jesus tells. He tells the story of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. Now, those ones are ones we've heard a lot, correct? Those are the parables that I've preached on each one of those numerous times. We talk about them in Sunday school lessons. You hear them in storybooks. They're the ones that show up in our daily bread or our little devotionals that we get on our apps when we have our daily readings. These are the three stories, and these three stories talk about the lengths we go to when we value something. All three of them talk about how do we respond to something when we see it as truly valuable. And every single one of those stories also ends with a declaration that we celebrate life. Life restored is of the greatest value. I don't think it can be inconsequential that these three stories describing when something is of value and of worth to us, we go to the ends of the earth to take care of it, to find it, to not lose it, to protect it, to hold on to it. That these three stories are told right before this one, because chapter breaks are actually something very recent for us. Yeah. When Jesus told these stories, when these were first accumulated, when these stories were first written down, when they were read for 1,000 years, 1,500 years before they were even translated into local colloquial languages, those chapter breaks weren't there. These stories were told together. The story of the lost sheep, the story of the lost coin, the story of the lost son, and the story of the shrewd manager were told together. They were heard together. When we would sit and we would look at them and read passages, we would hear those stories together. I think there's also another way that we can be able to then understand this, that when there is this idea of how God values things, and that may not be how we value things. And if we want to be honest about what we're devoted to and how we respond to that, then it might be different than how God would have us value things. As I was going through and I was reading this passage in a number of different translations, there was another translation that I read, and I liked this one. If you could go to the next slide, please, for me, Aiden. Thank you. This is the verses 8 through 9 and how they were in a different translation. Listen to this. Now here's a surprise. The master praised the crooked manager. And why? Because he knew how to look after himself. Streetwise people are smarter in this regard than law-abiding citizens. They are on constant alert, looking for angles, surviving by their wits. I want you to be smart in the same way, but for what is right. Using every adversity to stimulate you to creative survival, to concentrate your attention on the bare essentials so that you'll live, really live, and not complacently just get by on good behavior. I think this is a powerful statement for us to think about what this parable might mean for us, If we really wanted to just sum up this parable, it's this phrase right here where it starts with, they are on constant alert looking for angles, surviving by their wits. I want you to be smart in the same way, but for what is right. Using every adversity to stimulate you to creative survival. I like that phrase. And to concentrate your attention on the bare essentials so that you'll really live. That's another key part to this. And not complacently just get by on good behavior. What a difference that is if we were to live our Christian spiritual lives in this way. Not just complacently being okay, just trucking along, biding our time until we can get to that final reward, but to actually live, truly live in this devoted way. To think about this parable and what it might mean for us, I think we need to just ask ourselves two questions. And the first question is, what consumes us? What are we devoted to? What motivates us? What gets us up in the morning? What gives us the energy to keep going forward? And I think we can use a couple things to try to think about what this might mean if we're trying to just really ponder what consumes us. The first thought that I thought of, and this week it really came through to me a lot of times, is what is the first thing I think of when I wake up in the morning? What's the very first thing that I start? What's the very first problem I'm starting to try to solve? What's the very first thing that I'm trying to figure out a solution to first thing in the morning? Another thing I think about is when there is something at risk, what is it that I go to protect first? I think we all have lots of things in our lives, but when it comes to push come to shove, what are the essentials? What are the things that we are going to protect first? And I think for each of us, these are going to be different answers. For some of us, maybe it is money, like the Pharisees here who were struggling and they were consumed with money. Maybe it is money. Maybe I know that there's been times when there's been an unexpected bill or an unexpected damage that we are trying to figure out. I go into hyper creative mode. How am I going to get really creative to solve the solution? Maybe it's with identity. Maybe it's we are so consumed with what others think of us, of what we want others to see about us, about what we want others to not know about us. Maybe that's what we're so consumed with. We're so busy protecting how people see us that that's what we're consumed with. Maybe it's some other goal we have. Maybe there's something that we're trying to achieve. We have something tangible or intangible that we're trying to get to, a job, a certain financial place, a certain relationship status. Maybe we're trying to achieve something and we're going at it so hard that that's what is consuming us. I think it's important for us to think about this. What makes us get creative? What triggers that ruthless mode that we can go into in order to achieve whatever it is that we are consumed and devoted to? If we answer these questions, and if we're honest with ourselves, it will give us the answer of what we're devoted to. And I'm not saying that we should do this because I want us to all just wallow in guilt and feel bad if it's not the right answer. I think it's important that we have to be honest and acknowledging, because if we answer this first question of what we're devoted to, then we can ask the even tougher and perhaps even more pertinent question of, is it worthwhile? Is it of real value? Or is it fool's gold? Is it something that's shiny and intriguing, but it's not really of lasting worth? It's not going to actually add anything to our lives. It's not going to make our lives better in some way that is good for us. Now I'm going to share a quote that I found this week, and I'm going to add a disclaimer because I'm going to be quoting Joe Rogan. And I'm adding the disclaimer because Joe Rogan has yet to know the transformative grace of God. So I am not suggesting that he is someone to model yourself after. That's not what I'm going for here. But I think he is still capable of making an accurate observation, and I think I found one this week that does express, and it's fitting for what we're talking about. And he says this: look at the car he's driving, the watch he's wearing, the girl he's with. That's unattainable to many people, so it seems like it's valuable, but then you attain it. And then you realize, oh, that is not valuable. It was just difficult to get. And that's a big difference. There are so many things that we chase after in our life. Wealth. It is difficult to get. And the truth is, once you attain it, you actually aren't satisfied and you want to get more because it's never, ever enough. The same thing with the perfect physical body, the perfect physical structure that we have. Whether it's for health reasons or beauty reasons, it's still just as difficult and unattainable, because as soon as you reach what you think is that mile marker, there's going to be something else that's going to say, nope, actually you need to get just a little bit closer. This one little thing needs to change. You will constantly be chasing after it. Whether it's health or beauty, both of those can be deceptive goals. Perhaps status. You're just so driven, you want people to think of you a certain way. You want to have a certain amount of influence. You want to have a certain title. You want to have something about you that just shows the world and validates your worth. That is literally that phrase that we is translated in Song of Solomon, or not Song of Solomon, but in Ecclesiastes. Yeah, in Ecclesiastes sometimes, the chasing after the wind. Chasing after being able to influence, chasing after making sure everybody thinks a certain way about you, chasing after I want everybody to like me is a chasing after the wind. It is not possible, and it's ultimately empty. It's for nothing. Because when all is said and done, most of the things that we do chase, most of the things that we are consumed by, most of the things that we are devoted to are not of any real value. This parable is easy for us to gloss over and get confused by, especially when we are reading the Bible to just get something out of it. When we're busy looking for the how-to, or the checklist, or the feel-good moment. I just want to feel good for a moment. Or we're looking for some quick tip in order to just get back to our lives. If we are doing that when we read the Bible, it's very easy to gloss over this parable and to skip it, because it's not easy. But this is not what Jesus came to do. He is not a self-help guru. He didn't come to just give us some life hacks to make our life easier and to make it more enjoyable. He shows us what real worth is. He shows us what true value is, and then he gives us the chance to go after it with everything that we have. This parable is the reminder to stop and ask ourselves, what are we devoted to, and is it of any real value? And I want to close with this caveat, because I'm not just trying to say it's about giving and service. I know that has been the focus of a lot of my messaging lately, and a lot of that is because we've had 2 years of overwhelming messages that we just need to take care of ourselves. I just need to take care of myself. That has been a message we have heard, at least I have been hearing so strongly for 2 years, and I've been inclined to push back with this reminder that is never how God asked us to live. But that doesn't mean that devotion to God is about being consumed with work and giving and service alone. Pursuing God and his kingdom is not just about what we do for him. Pursuing God and his kingdom is also about pursuing those things that benefit us, that have real worth and value to us. It is about pursuing grace, pursuing mercy, pursuing rest, and pursuing hope. That's something that's been in my mind lately. Hope is an urgent thing that we pursue, not just salvation from sin in order to help us feel better or to help us be clean, but we pursue hope as if our lives depend on it, because our lives do depend on it. We cannot survive without hope. So we pursue God's hope as if we depended on it, because we do. We pursue his blessings. We pursue his goodness. We pursue his joy and his peace, because that is what we have been promised. We have been promised life and full life. What would it look like if we lived that kind of life? If we were devoted to those things of true value? It's not that we shouldn't be devoted to things that we think will benefit us. We should. But we just have to be honest of, are they actually benefiting from us? And in this, I have another quote that I want to share, and this is from St. Augustine, and he says, "But my sin is this, that I looked for pleasure, beauty, and truth, not in him, but in myself and in his other creations. And that search led me instead to pain, confusion, and error." This parable is not a warning that you shouldn't pursue things that you think will benefit you. It's about being honest that those things you think will benefit you will not. There is only one place that we can find this pleasure and beauty and truth and goodness for our lives, and it is not in ourselves, and it is not in anything else that has been created. I think this is where I'd like to leave us this morning. This is my prayer, not just for you, but this is my prayer for myself as well, that we may pursue God's joy and goodness, that we go after it with everything that we have, and we do it in the same way that the shrewd manager did in the parable that we read today, with creative survival and completely consumed and devoted to it. Please join me as we close in prayer. God, we are here this morning, and we are reminded to look into ourselves, not to beat ourselves up or to try to make ourselves feel bad enough that we'll make better choices, but to be honest. Are we pursuing the things that are actually making our life full of life? Are we pursuing those things that are of true value? Are we pursuing those things that are actually going to benefit us in the long run? God, help us to find ways to be consumed with pursuing you in that way, pursuing you with devotion in the way that we are seeking our lives to be full of grace and peace, to have lives that are so full of hope, that it is sustaining to us, that we are strengthened by your joy because that is what we are seeking with everything that we have. God, we pray that this week that is something that comes to our mind, that you bring it to our attention time and time again of how we can pursue you in a way that our lives become even more full of life. We pray this in your name. Amen.